I was also told a little more, I was also told that in a drought, the cows die first and the camels and the goats live longer. And the reason is that cows are ruminant, so they can only eat grass. So in a drought, the grass disappears, but there's still leaves, foliage, various kinds of other plants. So the goats and the camels can graze at all lengths, so they live longer. And I was also told that camels can drink 100 liters of water an hour. I tried to verify that on the internet, got lots of different statistics, but it was a development expert who told me that while we were watching some camels eat. So that's the inspiration. That it was a CAFOD trip where I was thinking about camels quite a lot, and I'll come back to the camels in a minute. As Andy said, I'm a trustee for CAFOD. They're committed to the idea that trustees should travel once every 3 years. Ideally, it obviously hasn't happened during the pandemic. They're very serious about this because CAFOD as a whole is trying to cut its flights in half to do as much of its business without flying for ecological reasons, but the trustee travel is still considered central, so that we are connected to the work that CAFOD is supporting around the world, but collectively as a group of trustees. There was a workshop that I could helpfully join as a theologian, supposedly. I don't know if I was any help. There was a workshop on developing a Pan-African church advocacy program, which was how CAFOD could, in various ways, support a Catholic church at regional levels, so not just national levels, to be advocating for things like against climate change or for good governance and peace and conflict resolution and things like that. So how CAFOD or its partners could support bishops' conferences and other agents within the church to kind of fulfill their full potential, which is probably considerably bigger than European Catholics have. So that was an interesting thing to watch as a theologian, very valuable as a trustee. But then there was a Verity, a senior CAFOD manager, normally based in Zimbabwe, was at the workshop, and she was coming along to go visit partners and work in northern Kenya, so I went along with her. So this wasn't, the whole thing wasn't invented for me as a trustee, but I kind of went along to things that were happening. So I should say that this talk actually has multiple purposes and probably won't be as smooth as some lectures I give. One purpose is simply to tell you what I saw. And the reason to tell you what I saw is that we met groups of people who thanked us very gravely for coming so far, who acknowledged that it was different to see with your own eyes than to read about things and you didn't know what to believe, but it was different when you saw with your own eyes, and then who asked us, please tell other people what you've seen. So I feel a kind of a direct burden put upon me that I must talk about this, and I've also written a couple of short pieces to try to fulfill that request. But on that level, I should confess from the start, I'm not an expert. All I'm doing is telling you what I saw. I'm not a specialist in Kenya. I'm not a development specialist. I'm a CAFOD trustee in virtue of being a theologian. But a second purpose is actually because I'm a CAFOD trustee, I thought it could be good, if you want to talk about how CAFOD works, illustrated by this or in other ways. Parishes support CAFOD for years. You get little CAFOD talks. You get little bits of information. But there is a kind of knowledge I suppose I've built up over the years in the role that I'm happy to, we might make a decision at some point whether we go on a theological theme or we go on an institutional theme and talk about how CAFOD works. It'll probably be a bit of both. And then the third thing is to reflect, as Father Andy said, to reflect on some themes that arose for me as I was watching, and themes of particularly compassion and the complexity of compassion, and also hope. And to get your help thinking about that, because I really haven't got to the bottom of thinking about any of these themes, and so I'm a bit of a crowdsourcing theologian, hoping that our conversation can help me along. But I'll start with the factual bit. So the trip, the place we were going in northern Kenya is called Marsabit, which is one of the 47 counties of Kenya. It's the largest county, but it's very sparsely populated because it's semi-arid or arid region. So it's used to dry weather. So it's got about under 500,000 population. And it was supposed to be a 9-hour drive out of Nairobi to get to the town of Marsabit at the kind of early bit of this county. And we were very grateful to have the road because there didn't used to be a road, but there was a very good paved road, very empty paved road, and I'll come back to that. At the beginning of the trip in Nairobi itself, there were signs of drought. So apparently Nairobi is normally a very lush, wonderful city, but you could see a lot of dead grass. There were still trees and flowers, and you could see, to me, kind of shocking to Western eyes, there'd be groups of goats nibbling the grass on the verge of a highway, like right next to the road. And I guess I was thinking health and safety, that doesn't look like a good thing. But the kind of shortage of grazing land, even at that point, meant that people were taking their animals, or the animals were going wherever they could find food. The manager of the office in Nairobi, the CAFOD manager of the office, when she was preparing me to come and tell me what clothes to wear, she said, oh, it gets as hot as 30 degrees, which isn't what we're supposed to have in Nairobi. This is global warming. So global warming, climate change is kind of an everyday part of people's analysis there. Anyways, it's an interesting drive. It got drier and drier, but maybe 3 hours along the drive. The drive ended up taking 11 hours rather than 9 because of a problem on the road in Nairobi. But so on maybe the 5th hour of the drive, we were seeing some ostriches, which are very interesting and quite dry landscape. But then it got drier and drier. Almost like a moonscape by the time we got there, just really nothing at all. We were supposed to make a courtesy visit to the Bishop of Marsabit on the way out, but we postponed it because we were so late. Then the next day, so we got to Marsabit town, then the next day we drove a further 2 hours out to this tiny compound with a little church and a few small buildings and a little primary school and a borehole, which is very important. Called Maikona, where we were given breakfast, and then we started driving around further. I didn't take photos, partly just because I'm a bad photographer and partly because I didn't feel like a tourist and I didn't feel like I should be clicking my camera all the time. So this is my excuse that the people who have taken photos were CAFOD on other visits. There's several videos, and I thought we could watch one and then I would comment on it a bit, just to give a bit more of the concrete flavor. So if we could run that video now. Now, this is always the problem, to get the sound. It's a 5-minute video.
Marsabit County is experiencing one of the most severe droughts that has ever happened, experienced before. The drought has always been there. It has there in arid and semi-arid areas of northern Kenya. It's not that we are saying that throughout the years has been raining. The dry spell is always there. But this, for the last 5 years or so, especially not in the it's like we are in the dry spell throughout. it is very much stressful to choose between saving life and looking at the resilience work that permanently solves the problem of the community. But next, you see, when you want to do development work, when you want to, like do a water structure, so that you can permanently, eradicate water, perennial water sources. Here there is somebody who is also dying of starvation. You have to choose. It is difficult. It's like you are between a rock and a hard place to choose. As such organization, we are always with these people. And people who are working for these organizations are people who belong to these communities, people who understand the problem of these communities.
So I don't actually know how good CAFOD is at making videos, but they don't have huge numbers of hits on the internet. I was talking to Andy about it before. But I quite often watch them. Sometimes we watch them as part of the trustee, as a kind of board of trustees, as a kind of reflection. So anyways, I wanted to talk in relation to the video we just saw, a bit about what I saw and also a bit about what one might think when one watches these videos. So the huts were all almost identical from the outside to the ones we saw. That's the way the huts are there. The people are pastoralists. They follow the herds. They move around where necessary. So the huts can be very rapidly disassembled and then put back together somewhere else. We went into one, and it wasn't nearly as sort of beautiful and richly furnished as hers. So there are various things. This was a video made 6 months ago. So there's various things that have probably changed in the 6 months. For instance, when I was looking at that, I became very attuned to looking out for signs of water or green. And you could actually see some green leaves on some trees in the distance, but we couldn't see that at all when we were there. So it's got worse. The failure of the rains has continued. But I was pointed to her hut as we drove by. Oh, there's the person that made the video. So I didn't meet Talasi, but I saw her hut from a distance. I met various groups of these pastoralists. Another change in the last 6 months is, so the guy who was sitting and talking, Bante, he traveled around during the day with us. And also the guy whom they showed interacting, who was wearing tinted sunglasses and dressed in white, whose name is Izako. He spent the whole day actually in the same car as I did, so I learned a lot from him. But they're no longer talking. Bante was talking about the dilemma between long-term development, livelihood, education, so work to help people thrive in the long term and saving lives. And that's no longer a live issue for the development workers anyways. The situation is so bad that they're just worried about the lack of enough funds to meet the life-saving needs. Although we did on the drive around see a water tank under construction and a borehole that went down 370 meters deep to get water. And apparently the development specialist I was traveling with said any borehole deeper than 80 meters is considered a deep borehole. So this was a very, very deep borehole. But it was working, and they were about to establish solar panels on it so that they didn't have to rely on diesel to make it work. But the other thing we saw as we traveled around were a lot of dead animals, dead donkeys and dead camels. So the irony was I was learning all these interesting facts about camels and mostly seeing, and how resilient camels are, and mostly seeing dead camels. There's something I found quite haunting in the sight of these dead animals. And I think it was captured by, we talked about this in a CAFOD board meeting, and I talked about what I'd seen, and then Verity gave the more expert overview of the situation more broadly. And her line was that when the camels die, the people are next. So we were seeing a situation at just that point that the camels had died and the people were speaking to us. But I wanted to talk about the video a little bit because, as I say, I'm not always super convinced. Well, at CAFOD's videos, I always watch them, and maybe because I have a nasty, cynical mind, there's certain questions I always ask myself when I watch them. So, for instance, how do we know that she wasn't prompted to say that? How could a mother be so good at putting her finger on the emotional center of the reality? When my children play, I'm happy. Just really articulate it. So one thing I wanted to say about what I saw, we met various groups of people, and of course there was a translator operating, but every time I was amazed at how concise they were, how they got to the heart of telling us what had happened without getting lost in the details, how they could articulate what it meant to them. And so I say this as someone who spends a lot of time reading student essays. And I can really appreciate a well-structured telling of something and the person who can just say the pithy thing necessary. So I was talking to my companions, why is this? Why are they so good at it? And I think there was one group where it was a slightly bigger group and it was the chief who spoke. And I think he probably had some practice at talking to other visiting groups because he made sure that the woman spoke first. I thought, okay, he knows what the development specialist wants. But there was another group, the first one we spoke to, they'd only moved to that spot a week earlier. They were pretty much in a state of shock. So Verity, originally from the Cotswolds, living in Zimbabwe for the last 10 years, said it's oral tradition. People in oral cultures are better at telling stories. But then Isako, the guy that we saw, if you remember, kind of dressed in slightly shiny white with glasses, sitting with people, started talking about, he was from those, he'd been raised by the same pastoralists. And he talked about the nature of the life you lead. If you might be moving around over, he said 300 kilometers, so say 200 miles, you might need to take your herds a long way. And there's, traditionally people didn't have telephones, didn't have access to newspapers. So you needed to know, is there conflict? Way over there on the other side where we might go, are there rains? Is the water better there? So he says the whole culture is very focused on gathering and transmitting information. And he gave us some examples, like you might be driving along the road and someone will run in a big panic to stop the car and you think, oh, he's hurt, he's in trouble. And then he'll stop the car and he'll just say, where are you from? And what's the news from there? So he's actually stopped the car to pick up the news. Or he told us that if you're a young person and you're out for the day and you come back and you said, oh, I met a stranger from Iziola, and then you don't have any news, you're considered completely irresponsible. So you always have to gather the news and presumably retell it, that this is important in this pastoralist culture. So the first thing I want to say is I now believe CAFOD doesn't make very doctored videos. They don't practice with people. If that's what she said, that's what she said from what I can tell. My second cynical thought was, well, what do they really mean when they say people from the local communities? So they said people from the local communities are working there. This is a really, really important principle for CAFOD, and I found it very hard to understand. They'll always talk about partners, the centrality of the partners, working with partners. And partners is this sort of vague word that suggests businesses or marriages or whatever, but it's sort of central to the way CAFOD works that you don't have people from England and Wales going and starting to dig a borehole, deciding where, what's needed and digging it and implementing it. They're always alongside local groups. So in this case, Isako, the guy who was sitting on a stone and talking to people, is the director of Caritas Marsabit. So Marsabit's a diocese as well as a county. The Caritas is the humanitarian wing of the diocese. But he was telling us about how he came from these same hurting families and how he was given an education at the place where we stopped for breakfast, and how terrifying it was for his parents who, because the distances are so great that he had, as a 7-year-old, he had to go on board. And so they had to show up on a certain day at a certain place where the truck, and put their 7-year-old onto a truck and send them off to be educated by people who spoke a different language and served different kinds of food, and wonder if he would ever come back, and how terrified the parents were, and how terrible he found the food, and even the water didn't taste right. And I think he said that, they hit us and I was just miserable, and when I came back, my parents saw me looking miserable and skinnier. And then he said, the missionaries who ran this, they made great sacrifices for us. So it was this amazing contrast between presenting a very imperfect life of a 7-year-old going to boarding school, I guess like you might get if, the upper classes in Britain, when they're sent to prep school, don't have a great life either. But presenting this very tough life and then seeing it through the lens of the missionaries having made sacrifices, because he got an education. He went first into teaching and then into development. So now he's back working for the diocese among the people directing Caritas Marsabit. So CAFOD has worked alongside Caritas Marsabit for decades now, not always in terrible situations like this, usually in a more positive vein. But that means that when this kind of thing happens, the relationship's already there. They know who to trust. They know this is functioning well. There's also a shared church bureaucracy. I'm quite struck by that. You can drop into a diocese anywhere in the world as a Catholic, and if someone says, I'm the Justice and Peace lead for the diocese, you know what it means. You know what justice and peace encodes and so on. So the emphasis on working for local people is really central to CAFOD, because it's never wanted to do a kind of white saviorism where we're the central actors going and doing things. And we wouldn't have the knowledge, we wouldn't know how to make the choices, so it's a matter of listening to the local organizations on the ground who see best what to do. And that's kind of part of the richness of where CAFOD is now, I suppose, is it's got these long-term partnerships. It knows, I mean, of course, sometimes you have to say goodbye to a partner, your ways part or something, you find new ones. It's not, but it's having an organization that has a 60-year history means it's picked up a lot of experience, and it also is able to, I'm going on about CAFOD more than I intended here, but it's also able to bring people together in different ways across different countries. I'll give you an example of that later on. I should go back to my bit about Marsabit. So the one other thing to say about Isako was, as you could see, you'd have to watch it again now that I told you, he's smiling the whole time. And he was always smiling and laughing a little bit the whole time we were with him, except when he said there was an absolute mismatch between the amount of funds they had and the amount of need there was. There was some funds from CAFOD, there was some funds from Miserior, which is CAFOD's German counterpart, and that's all. So across this particular day, we stopped and listened to 4 different groups and heard a similar story from them. So groups of pastoralists. They were all very gracious. Nobody asked us for anything. They all started by thanking us for coming. They knew it was a long way to come. Those who had been supported by Caritas Marsabit through a CAFOD program thanked us for that. There was one woman who said, the rain stopped, the animals started dying, it got very, very grim. And then this CAFOD program started where they were given food vouchers, where once a month they could go. So if you give people vouchers, they have more choice over what food they get. they only directly bring food in places where people don't have access to stores. And anyways, so she said, then it was as if it rained. But they had been told that this was 6 months support. And so there was a program of 6 months support for immediate food relief and building a water tank for the longer term. And we saw the water tank, and you could see the hills. You could see how when it rained, it would come down and fill up the water tank. And people felt like this was a real investment in their place where they wanted to stay. But then people were saying, as the 6 months got near the end, we got more and more anxious. And now we're in a state of shock, because that period of 6 months that CAFOD, that particular program was supporting for, had come to the end, and Caritas Marsabit didn't have more money for it. So kind of shocking tales. So I was left with images in my mind of the dead donkeys and the dead camels especially, and then of the kind of beautifully dressed, beautifully gracious people we met. And, you know, maybe I saw 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 dead animals in this kind of drive. It's a very spread out area. But the larger context needs to be spoken about, because it's not a localized drought just in the north of Kenya. This is a drought that's affecting Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, and in some of those countries there's massive conflict as well. So, as I say, at a recent CAFOD board meeting, I described what I had experienced to my fellow trustees, because I guess they could, you know, feel a connection to me. And then Verity, the one I'd been traveling with, gave the more professional version. And to me, it was like the experience of if you've been watching most of a film and you got to know a particular set of people, and then the camera view lifted up and you suddenly saw it multiplied. So I saw 40 or 50 or 60 dead animals, and I met 4 groups of, you know, 20 to 40 or 60 people at a time. But they say that 13.2 million livestock have died, and that 23 million people are affected and in need of aid across these countries. So it's scary, very, very frightening, scary, terrible situation. It's not just one of these things that happens in Africa. It's easy for us to think, we're kind of trained, oh yeah, drought, Africa, that's not news, we've had those before. This really is, everybody was saying it's unprecedented, it's never been in our lifetimes before. Even of our oldest people don't remember it. It's worse than the drought that happened in the 1980s that you might remember, the Ethiopian drought, Live Aid, huge fundraising, over 1 million people died of famine. But this drought has gone on longer than that one. So everybody thinks it's a consequence of the climate change. So it's a kind of terrible injustice that people who in no way have contributed to climate change are the ones who are feeling it. The media are not yet interested. So that was something we talked about. Why are the media not interested? So, and we've talked about this actually for several years. I mean, I've been hearing on the board of CAFOD about the situation in East Africa with great anxiety for a number of years. Do people know what the DEC is, the Disaster Emergency Committee? So CAFOD and several other agencies keep having a fight at the DEC. We need to do an appeal for East Africa. But one of the DEC's criteria for doing this kind of appeal that gets a lot of attention is that the broadcasters are interested. So other things keep coming up that are newsworthy because they're sudden. So this is a slow onset disaster. Again, people think there's not a new story in, you know, poverty and drought and famine in Africa. Part of the problem is that the governments do not want to declare famine because it doesn't look good politically if you say, ooh, we're supposed to be a middle-income country in Kenya and we've actually got large parts in famine, or even poorer countries than Kenya doesn't look so good. I was saying to my CAFOD counterpart, to Verity, you know, why can't you get Catholic journalists and do what you're doing with me and take them out here, won't they? And she said, no, we tried. They say it's not a story. And then she said, well, in the past, what NGOs would have done is bring celebrities, and then the media would have followed. but that has now been deemed white saviorism, and so it shouldn't be done. So I brought that back to the board, and CAFOD has a complex response to that. But anyways, that's a scary thing, that we've become so alert to not seeming condescending, not seeming like we're in charge, that we've actually blocked one of the ways to get around the disinterest in the media. At the beginning of our trip, so I had many, many hours in the car talking to the people I was with. So at the beginning of the trip, Verity said to me, that kind of mass death that you remember from the 1980s is a thing of the past. The humanitarian world is better organized. We have early warning systems. You don't have to worry about that. This is still terrible. There will still be terrible consequences. Communities pushed into destitution, children malnourished. That has lifelong consequences. But at least you don't have to anticipate the mass deaths. So I thought, wow, there's a piece of good news that, you never hear the good news with sense of progress. And then 24 hours later, when we'd driven all around, she said, no, I've lost confidence in that. I'm so shocked, not just about what I've seen, but by what I haven't seen, because the road's been empty. I haven't seen convoys of trucks going in with food. I haven't seen big banners that are saying Oxfam here, USAID over here. It's just empty. No one was there. So again, it's really very, very sort of scary setup. So I'm nearly at the end of my factual bit of telling you what I saw and heard. I'll just try to end on a slightly more positive note. So what CAFOD could do, even in whatever we did, would be small. We're a small country, it's a small organization, but CAFOD has been doing something, as these people we saw testified to. A couple days after we got back, Verity told me that she had made sure that further funds from CAFOD's core general funds were released to go to Marsabit. And then this might be under wraps, but I think we made a decision at the Board of Trustees for complex reasons, not just because we happen to have seen a lot, but for complex reasons having to do with what the Finance Committee said and the level of contingency reserves that CAFOD needs, and how consistently it had been balancing its budget over the last 10 years under difficult circumstances. We decided we did not need quite the level of contingency reserves that we thought we did, and we had some excess. So CAFOD's committing further funds to East Africa. So that means, assuming some of you are CAFOD supporters, or your parish is certainly supporting CAFOD, that means you are doing something. Funding you have given is doing something. You're not doing nothing. And you can go on doing things if you want, of course. You can either give to CAFOD in general or any other organization like that, or there's a specific World Food Crisis appeal that CAFOD has that you can give to if you feel so inclined. So that's the end of my factual bit. And I'll pause there for questions or comments. And as I say, I'm not an expert, so I might not be able to answer them all. And then I'll go on to another bit of the talk. Does anyone have?
Yes, if you look at what's happened in Bangladesh with water, you look at what you just sharing with us about the lack of water, do you get the conclusion, Karen, that the climate change is going to make parts of the globe uninhabitable? So this is going to go on, and then eventually the people will have to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's quite possible. So there's going to be, what do they talk about? Climate refugees eventually. There's going to be mass movements of people eventually, and that's going to contribute to conflict and lots of other problems. So, I mean, it was one thing I was wrestling with. Should we just be sweeping people up and say, go to the city? I think they have been investing in these things that make them more resilient. And it's pretty much up to the local people. First of all, I think when they have to move, their communities will be broken up, their culture will be destroyed, their knowledge will be lost, their way of life will be lost. They'll be sucked into, often, when rural communities are broken up and sucked into an urban context, into a sort of I have a student who's doing a project for CAFOD, and he's come up with this very vivid phrase of vortices of sin, where you have worse and worse choices. Do you go into prostitution, or do you starve? Do you accept criminal work, or do you do something? So the destruction of the communities that are built up and the investment that they've made in the water tanks and the boreholes, it might come, but it's not something to be rushed into. But I do think the longer term means that some parts of the world are going to be uninhabitable. But I haven't heard of places that used to be uninhabitable that are becoming nice. I'm not sure that the world is becoming, you know, apart from the fact that maybe we can make better wine in Britain, I've heard. But so that is a scary long-term thing. Yeah, so I mean, it depends on how long the drought goes on for. So they're not infinitely sustainable. But if you have boreholes and water tanks, you can sustain for a longer. You can wait longer between rains, basically, I think. Yeah. But I know that I was told that they were doing a lot of building in Nairobi. And we could see a lot of building as we drove around Nairobi. And the person driving me said this was very worrying because people kept putting down boreholes, so the water table there is drying up. So yeah.
I'm just thinking about what you said about the CAFOD videos. Well, CAFOD are always walking a line, and you kind of allude to it. You've got to show people back and stick their hands in their pockets. You've got to kind of preserve the dignity of the people that they're trying to help and not present them as really victims.
Yeah.
You gave a very cogent example about December celebrity there. I suppose you spoke about being cynical man. Many people are much more cynical, and a kind of a priori to reject the whole idea of charity. The idea that organisations like CAFOD can actually make any positive difference. So I suppose have a lot of sympathy with CAFOD in their sort of dilemma or difficulty about how to present things and how to pitch them for them.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched them swing a little bit over 6 years. So there was one movement where they said we have to tell harder-hitting stories. But they are very committed to maintaining the dignity of the people that are in their videos. And they're real people, and they check with them before they put them on. But they don't show starving children. They don't show people in pathetic states. So they were coming closer. They were showing her having a difficult choice to make. But she wasn't weeping and saying that her child was starving or something. The general cynicism that organizations like CAFOD do anything, I'm just trying to think where that comes from. Probably those of you who are cynical wouldn't have shown up tonight. So probably, I'm not sure if I need to address that to this audience, but I think there are all kinds of examples of bad practice in development work, and have been, and some of them are, you know, from the worst case of Oxfam having somebody who was sexually exploitative and passing him to a different place before they got rid of him, to just stories of ineffective development aid, politically oriented development aid. I have an interesting experience I had. So my father was a development economist, and he's the one who brought me up Catholic. But I also had my best friend was a atheist Jew who was also working in development. And I asked both of them, and my father's even much more cynical than I am. But anyway, so I asked both of them, if you're going to give money, what kind of an organization should you give money to? And they both said to a religious organization, to a church organization, including my Jewish atheist friend, because they're long-term, they're there on the ground. And my father, thinking like an economist, said, you get the free infrastructure. You don't have to build everything. They're already there. So, but also, so there is that it is a very long-term relationships that people like Bante and Isako have with those communities, but also that we have, that, you know, people within CAFOD have. So the Kenyans who are CAFOD in Nairobi have long-term relationships with the people in Caritas Marsabit, and so do people from England, so I spoke to Pat Jones, who used to work in CAFOD a long time ago. She said, oh, Marsabit, we were working there 40 years ago. Doesn't mean CAFOD is everywhere in the world. So it is partly where it gets alongside partners that are doing the kind of thing that look right to it and that correspond to what it's doing. So it's also a form of what kind of solidarity would you want in the church if you know that your brothers and sisters are on the other side of the world? What would you invent? The first thing you would do is just say, I'm going to rush and give them some money, but then you would think, but I don't know who to give the money to. I don't know how to do it well. So maybe I need a bit of an organization that builds up relationships. Maybe I want to work with people that I know that are good there. So I think if you started to think what would be the right way to show your solidarity for, not just for suffering, but for injustice that people are undergoing on the other side of the world, you would come up with something quite like CAFOD, I think. I mean, yeah, I might not be the most unbiased person on that.
How does CAFOD judge whether any intervention is successful or not? It's very difficult to know.
Yeah. This is an ongoing theme of, I'm currently chairing the Strategy and Performance Committee, and we're asking them. So there's a whole series of ways. I mean, partly they operate within the world of development, where they all do something called MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and that will be woven into every project. So you can wind up knowing on a particular project how many people got food, how much water there was, or how many children were sent to school.
In this project where you got a crisis, what outcomes do you look at to measure to see whether that any impact?
I mean, I don't think they take a population survey of a particular place. I think it will be. I guess what we're struggling with, it's hard to aggregate because if you do, this isn't quite an answer to your question, so because I'm not sure I understand it. I think the success would be people are provided with life-saving support. In this case, the situation is so dire that there's not a lot of worry about choosing which people need to get the support. The support always goes to the women in the family, like the food vouchers go to the women, but they're doing it to whole villages. I think other times they're more selective about how they're doing it. Projects that are big enough get externally evaluated, but that costs money, so you don't do it for every small thing you're doing. Making absolute decisions between one country and another, I don't think there's an absolute way. CAFOD's committed to working with the most marginalized. So that's one reason that it doesn't spend all its money in Nairobi, that it's supporting far-flung places that are hard for other people to get to, that it has long-term contacts with. I'm not quite answering your question well, but it will work in places where it has partnerships, where it knows what it's doing. So CAFOD hasn't traditionally worked in Somalia, but Trocra, which is its Irish counterpart, has. So CAFOD is supporting work by Trocra, who know who to work with and how to work, and it'll get reported back from Trocra what it's done. The earthquake in Turkey and Syria, CAFOD hasn't worked in Turkey, but it does have a lot of partners in Syria, so it's spending almost all its money in Syria, but it didn't want to do nothing in Turkey, so some of its money is going to the kind of coordinated efforts of Caritas Internationalis, which is the umbrella organization of all the CAFOD-like things around the world. So it's doing a little bit in Turkey, but mostly in Syria, where most organizations can manage Turkey and not Syria, so that's useful. So I don't think there's a great mathematical way of knowing you're absolutely saving the most lives for your money, but there's a pretty careful, thoughtful process of where we'll put the money and why. So, yeah. But part of working through partnerships, so a contrasting kind of agency would be Mary's Meals, where you know exactly how many meals you've served and you know exactly what the next bit of progress would be. Or I guess I understand the way, say, the Bill Gates Foundation or some huge American foundation might work. You might say, tuberculosis, we're going to try to work on that. And then you have a very highly focused project. and you can make progress. And those things may have their place, but what CAFOD is doing is listening to the people on the ground, what do you need here, not knowing in advance this is the thing we're going to do. And that means inevitably, so it's very relationship-based, which again to me feels there's something very authentically Catholic and churchy about that it's working through relationships rather than through, I'm going to sit in one part of the world and pick a theme and execute that, and then I can measure it really well. So the cost is it's much harder to measure. But they are working hard on measuring as best they can, and it's a constant theme in our conversations as trustees with them.
I suppose the problem with something like the gates thing is that it makes the people giving the stuff feel much better, but it isn't necessarily what
Yeah.
the people locally really want
Yeah.
or need for that matter.
Yeah, this was a long time ago, but my Jewish development friend said that it was literally as ridiculous as the fact that Scandinavia would send nice furniture into things, whatever, everyone would give a bit what they have, but
certainly,
yeah.
in my lifetime, I have a friend who went off to Korea when it was really suffering dreadfully with a French Catholic organization, and that was very interesting talking to her, because they learned that the thing is, you did not go in and say what you needed. The local diocese, in her case, the bishop, said, look, what we actually need is something that stops these people who are coming into the towns because they're desperate, to help them to stay
Where they are,
yes.
yeah.
And that means the young men have got to be given agricultural training and experience and something.
Yeah.
And so that's what they did.
Yeah. So
She learned.
yeah, exactly. So the power dynamics are complicated and never perfect, because there is never an equal power dynamic between the organization in a country like England and Wales, or part of the church like England and Wales, and Caritas and most of it. But they're working as hard as they can not to come in and say, we know what's best for you.
And 50 years ago, that was really a learning experience
Yeah.
for those people.
Well, I think it's
They didn't mean to do it like that.
right. So are there any other questions, or shall I go on to, well, maybe I should give you a choice. Yep, question.
So you mentioned food vouchers go to the women, and we had a talk before about Bangladesh, and again, interaction with the women. And there's quite a lot of evidence that shows that, if you give money to the women, society gets better faster. What the hell is going on? Please tell me what.
This is where I get to the end of my expertise. Or, yeah. It's strange that in so many different cultures they would say that. But I think it's partly because in many cultures, the women are bearing the brunt of the poverty. That's what they say, that women and children are more affected. So if you empower the women more, you're also rebalancing things a bit. I mean, presumably it's complicated, and sometimes they may give the food voucher to the women, but the men may have some say in how it's spent. But also, if the women are doing the cooking, it's probably quite good that they have the food vouchers. So to be a little more precise, Isako explained, they do an analysis of any given place. If appropriate, they just give cash. So cash programming is kind of a thing that you'll hear about sometimes. So people then have full choice of what they do with their money. If the people don't have the infrastructure to receive the cash, which probably depends on how many mobile phones they have, then they give food vouchers if there's shops near enough where they can send it. If they don't have that, then they transport the food. So that way you don't disrupt the local economy more than you need to.
I think as well, culturally, the men were off traveling with the animals.
Well, that's true.
So
Yeah.
I think historically the women
Yeah. Yeah.
to
To
maintain
yeah.
the domestic.
Yeah. Certainly the younger men, anyways. Yeah. No, because I told you I got to the end of my knowledge. I'm not going to generalize about what's wrong with men all over the world. That would not be a wise move for me to do. It's the kind of.
If you said
You think it would be okay to work with them? Oh, there'd be a riot. Oh,
It'd be a riot, yeah, because we're not willing to put up with that now.
yeah.
But it just seems, I mean, okay, of course I'm sitting here as a man and I'm asking myself, what the hell
Yeah.
is going on?
I mean, it might be partly in, I've always assumed that it's something to do with that the women's connection to the children is on average thicker. So,
The men in the places you're going to.
well, so the men were there, but then I don't know what they would look like under normal circumstances because the herds had died. So nobody had anything to do. So they were all sitting together. So we saw the men and women. I mean, the men spoke much more than the women. They were more confident. So there was a power imbalance. And Faraday was clear that if she'd had more time, she would have liked to have some conversations with only women, because when you had a woman speaking to women, often different things could be heard.
Do you know if the men were looking after the animals and going off with them, did they have little plots to grow food? Because what did they eat apart from...
So apparently it's very hard, I heard, to persuade pastoralists to grow food. They really don't like to. So they would eat the milk and the meat, and they would sell the animals and buy other food. That's pretty much the way it normally went. But there had been some projects to try to get people to start growing. And in one place, when we went, the people said, now we're really, really ready to get back to our vegetable growing, because they had tried it. And somebody said, to get pastoralists to say they want to grow vegetables, that's a real triumph. So I think they're resistant to vegetable growing. But I thought we could talk more about CAFOD and the way it works. So maybe, but otherwise I want to talk about compassion, some thoughts I had. So, okay, you're nodding, I'll go on to, since I'm slightly more qualified as a theologian to talk about a theme like this. So there's a term in New Testament Greek, which I cannot really pronounce very well. It's very hard to pronounce, so I'm going to try it. Splachnitsamai. And I had a colleague once, a New Testament professor, who said, if this word were easier to pronounce, people would be writing lots of books saying this is the theological center of the New Testament. But it's just too unpleasant a word. What it means literally is something like to have your bowels moved or to have your guts twisted. And having your guts twisted is what happens to Jesus when he sees the crowds and he has pity on them because they're hungry. And it's also the same word that you have when the Good Samaritan sees the man lying by the side of the road, and it's also the same word. You can see why it's starting to sound quite central. Also the same word when the father of the prodigal son sees him coming from a distance. And it's an interesting word because it's very physical, very visceral, of course. It's something that happens to you. So I was thinking about this because we were going around and listening to these groups of people, and they were telling us these heart-wrenching or gut-wrenching stories in a very dignified way. But, the first story was, well, we originally came from around here, and there's good water here. But then we went 20 miles over that way and set up there because it was very green and there was really good pasture. And life was good. We had to go a bit further to get the water, but life was good. It rained. The flocks grew bigger. We were happy, and then the rain stopped, and then the flocks all died, and now we have nothing left. So we've come back here. It was to this little place by this tiny mission, which looked like about the size of Old Durham Gardens where I am, the Old Durham, that like about 6 or 8 houses worth at most. So they said, now we've come back here so that if we fall down, if we faint with hunger, a relative, so someone from another village will see and help us get up. And maybe we can be seen. The government will see us here. Or maybe the church will see us. Somebody will see us. So they had simply come back and plonked themselves down on this place that looked like the absolute back of beyond to me, that we'd had to travel 11 hours from Nairobi to get to in order to be visible, in order to be at the center of things so they could be visible. So you listen to this story, and we desperately wanted to do something right now for the people right in front of us So that's the sense of gut twisting, but it would have been totally inappropriate to try to do anything right then for those particular people. You know, what would I do? Oh, I have some Kenyan shillings, can I give them to you? Or, oh, well, we actually got some nuts in the car. Or, oh, I'm a CAFOD trustee, I'll make sure they do something about it. All for different reasons, those would all have been really inappropriate. You know, the dignity of the people, the process by which CAFOD works, the whole structure, you know, the trust put in me as a trustee. If I started to make promises I had no authority to, that would be terrible. I wanted to do these things, and I had to sit on that urge and just listen and just say, thank you for telling us. You know, we've heard what you've said, we'll tell other people, but couldn't actually do anything. And that was a sort of strangely painful experience. So I was thinking about that, but it was the guts being twisted, just like in all those biblical things, and then it would have been inappropriate to do something to relieve that feeling. So one phrase that I came up with for myself was, you know, we often talk about impulse buying. You see something really nice, or you're hungry in the store and you buy it. And so what about impulse giving? Like, I find if I'm feeling flush with money and I read there's been a disaster, I might give to it. Or sometimes even I read a story in the newspaper about just some tiny thing. Like, I don't know if anyone else saw the story about the lovely autistic girl who was a great ballet dancer, and she got a place in a ballet school, but her mother didn't have funds to take her there and to get her the uniform. And The Guardian had an article on this and a little crowdfunding link at the bottom. So I actually gave £20 because it was beautifully written, and the mother seemed like a lovely person, and the daughter seemed like a lovely person, and I thought, I can give this money. But I knew at the same time it was a bit of an odd impulse, and I checked at the end of the day, and they'd raised all the money they needed. So if the story is written the right way, we can all have this impulse. Somebody told me that anything to do with puppies in America gets funded much better than anything else. So I was thinking about, I don't want to say impulse giving is bad. I think it's good that we have the impulse and good that we act on it, but it's something I'm wrestling with and haven't really, it's, I guess, why I'm talking about the complexities of compassion. I mean, if that impulse is really important, it's at the center of the New Testament, but if we act on it unthinkingly or crudely just to release our own discomfort at what we see, we can often act poorly. So like one rule of thumb I've come up for myself is it's okay to do impulse giving as long as you match it with some more thoughtful giving. So the puppy story upsets you, but give to, you know, SVP at the same time or something. So I'm trying to work out how to think about this, and this is where I could use some help, because I have come across people who try to rationalize altruism. So there's a movement called effective altruism where, and you know, they're very earnest people, but it's all about saving the maximum number of lives per dollar. And they have calculations by which they do it. And there seems something really unhuman about that. And also against the dignity of people. If all you think about is life-saving rather than paying attention to particular people in front of you and so on. But at the same time, if I had reacted just to the people I saw and not paid attention to the wider context, that would be irresponsible. So how you find the responsible point that's not unemotional, not detached from the emotions, because I'm just not persuaded that a kind of purely rationalized form of altruism would be right. And it also would be the kind of same problem as with the Bill Gates, that it doesn't actually involve paying much attention to particular communities and people. So in Durham Martyrs Parish, Father Colum asked me to speak after Mass about the same topic. And when I got along to the third Mass of the weekend, I said, did he want me to go longer? Because at the second one, he told me I was a bit compact. And he said, well, maybe not. I just remembered there's a baptism. And, but could you link what you're saying to baptism? So I had the length of the Mass to try to figure out a link to baptism. And I thought about water, but I decided, no, not really. And what I came up with, which I'm still thinking about, is it would be nice to say the heart of Christianity is compassion. It's this splanchthemai. But actually, that's a human thing. You don't need to be baptized to feel compassion. We all share that reaction to when we see people in trouble. But to baptize that baby is to try to commit yourself to bringing him up, it was a he in this Sunday, in a community that helps each other channel our compassion and sustain our compassion and learn to be compassionate more effectively. Learn not to make the mistakes of foolishly acted upon compassion, which we've all done, I'm sure, at some time in our lives and humiliated someone. So one way that I think of CAFOD, but not only CAFOD, is it's an organ that helps us. It's an element within the church that helps us, should help us if it's working well, channel and use our compassion. And it takes the fruits of that compassion in the money we give and makes a real difference. But it also makes sure that that our compassion is channeled with wisdom, and that because it's also trying to educate us in schools and in parishes. It's also forming the compassion. But CAFOD's just one thing. The SVP would be, from what I understand of the SVP, there's a lifelong spirituality that people are practicing, nurturing each other in, supporting each other in, knowing the local community, knowing what works and what doesn't work, and many other organizations. So maybe it has to be visceral. We shouldn't. So one solution, my father, the economist, told me the problem is don't ever know which charity is best. You can't really give away a lot of money because you can't figure out what would be the very best way to do it. And there seems to be something wrong about that, to want to optimize and be so perfect that you always put off the moment of compassion. My father didn't do that altogether. He made sandwiches for the local soup kitchen or whatever. But find some middle way between merely gut reactions and over-rationalized, kind of almost utilitarian approach. And I think the church, when it's functioning well, we should be helping each other to do that better. So that is my proposal, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that and whether you can help me think about what's the right way to deal with our compassion, to enact our compassion.
On daytime television, when one has the misfortune to watch it, you get a string of charitable appeals, ranging from puppies to gorillas to people, etc. And I find the biggest danger for me is that I become anaesthetized. I look at all these, I think, there's just so many, I just can't cope. So it's worth thinking about how you push that aside and say, perhaps with a period of reflection using St. Ignatius, to say, come on, please God, give me guidance here. Otherwise I'm going to sit and do nothing. Because all these adverts, I can't cope. Any thoughts?
That sounds like a good idea to me. So I think compassion fatigue. So over-impulsive compassion is one thing that I'm kind of thinking, and compassion fatigue is another one that they talk about, which I think means we're tired of hearing about the same old problems, so our compassion's run out. But yours is actually the kind of overwhelm, that there are so many good causes asking for one's help. And again, it's hard to find what's the sweet spot. I like the Ignatian discernment. Some kind of discernment is necessary. But one thing you could do is, and I've met, say, people in St. Joseph's who said this to me, oh yes, all sorted, got my direct debit set up to CAFOD, I really believe in CAFOD, and they get the gift aid that way. I think they get it if you give in the parish basket as well. But anyways, all sorted, got my direct debit set up. So on the one hand, that's good because CAFOD does, or any organization does very well with steady support. And on the other hand, you think it's kind of slightly, if that's all, and I'm not saying that for that particular person, but if that were all that I did, that would also be worrying. Like, I've ticked my compassion box by setting up my £50 a month to CAFOD, if that's what's appropriate to me, and I'm done. So something between that and then the person who sits there torn by anxiety with every successive daytime TV appeal that comes on.
My thought process has been through the last 3 years, particularly with CAFOD. You get the appeals and you give and you get another one. So you sort of dealt with one issue, then you have guilt because you're not
Yeah.
getting to the next appeal. So there's no right answer, I don't think. There's just not a balance between the two.
Well, you get bombarded with
Yeah.
appeals. I mean, it's not, I do watch television, but I get almost every post appeals from some immensely good cause.
Which seems to be more of them.
It's terrifying. And I mean, I cannot decide what one ought to do. And I take John Marston's point. That's a good idea. But it is easier to make a direct debit out since you then stop worrying.
Yes.
You're being
Yes.
either too sort of Scrooge-like or
Yeah.
alternately too Bill Gates-like. I mean,
Yeah.
it really is complicated.
It is tricky. I mean, I do think direct debits for people who can afford it are a good thing to do. They are hugely useful to a charity. So I wouldn't want to dismiss it. But I'm just thinking how close it comes to this biblical idea of allowing your guts to be wrenched sometime. So I gave a talk in Darlington yesterday. This is only my second outing for this talk, but again, I feel this obligation to the people who've asked me, so I'm making and it's part of my job as well to do outreach to the diocese. But it suddenly occurred to me yesterday an analogy with my middle son was having trouble with job interviews because he's kind of, you met Robert, probably the blonde one. Anyways, he's kind of very, very shy, a bit shy. And he would treat the job interview a bit like a test and just try to give the right answer as briefly as possible. And I tried to coach him out of this by saying, think of it more as a human interaction and you're being generous and you're letting them get to know you and you're being expansive. And it didn't really help. And then I got some help from someone who's a bit better at it than me. And he talked to Robert and understood what the problem was. And he gave him a 3-word phrase to say at the end of every answer, which is, and what else? So Robert would finish an answer and then he would say, and what else? In his mind, not out loud. And then he would see if he had something else to say. And that was much more useful than me trying to paint this picture of what should be his overall attitude. So I was just wondering about this phrase, and what else? Whether, I mean, this is unpleasant because it suggests we could never get to the point of knowing we'd got there. But maybe, maybe that's the nature of the gospel, that you set up your direct debit to CAFOD. And then you have to say, and what else? And maybe you say, during Lent, I won't have this, and I'll give CAFOD or someone else something extra. But I think what else can't be is I'll support more and more and more organizations. I think there is something worthwhile about getting to know 2 or 3. And then also, so you trust them, you can be a longer-term supporter, but also you can start taking action for them. So one way in which my presentation has been a bit distorting is that CAFOD is not just emergency relief. It's not just life-saving in disasters. It's also long-term development work, but it's also campaigning. So if you may or may not trust CAFOD or like it or feel drawn towards it, it might not be your vocation. But if something like that is, then the what else could be, I'll spend longer reading their website. I'll try to learn what they're telling me is the theme now. And then you might hate it because it's written at the wrong level. I sometimes have trouble with it. So that might not work, but you keep trying that. Maybe the call of conversion is that we're never going to get to the end. We're never going to get to a point of satisfaction that we're doing everything we should. Yeah.
I think perhaps one reason why we're never going to get to that brute reality is that the world is unjust and unequal. You experience that little sharp thing when you sat in front of the people at Mars and get really deeply true for us. And because there is that class inequality, we are always going to feel uncomfortable. Should feel uncomfortable.
That's really helpful, yeah.
I suppose also when you were saying that, the other thing I thought was one thing the Lord says, when you give alms, your left hand should know what your right hand should do. And one really valuable thing that CAFOD do is put that barrier in between so that it's not a sort of humiliating relationship with one of you. There's a safe distance between the person
Yeah.
who gives the money
Yeah.
and the person who receives it.
Yeah.
Takes away that sort of back.
Yeah, that's interesting. But that also, so that's a really helpful point, that the discomfort we have is because we live in a world that's wrong, and we can and we can never feel right in it. We can never feel at ease. You know, you could dream of being St. Francis and ripping your clothes off, and maybe that's the right way for some people. But if that's not your way, then discomfort ought to accompany you, not because you're personally at fault, but because you're living in an unjust structure, and it always causes problems. So yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, the arm's length distance that we give, and then but you're not giving it to the person you give, that is really valuable. I like the left hand, right hand thing, but it also has its frustration, because what it means is, this is the other thing I ponder about the problem with things like CAFOD is, you know, how old are you? How long have you been hearing about this terrible need? And whatever you do, it doesn't go away, it remains terrible. So there's a kind of cycle of addressing a problem where you feel it should be addressed. But then, because the world is so big and it's so full of problems, even if CAFOD has been successful, even if you have been successful through your money, CAFOD somewhere, you're still going to have another heart-wrenching story somewhere else. So that the compassion fatigue is also, over time, the fact that the world is not, you know, not noticeably getting cured of its problems, which might be needing to reconcile ourselves that we're not God and can't fix it all immediately and have to keep trying. CAFOD does lobby governments at every level. So
our government, which has just reduced the overseas aid that we give, are they lobbying about that?
Yes, they're doing what they can, although they're more worried about what they call quality than quantity. And it's not just that it's reduced it, but that it's changed the rules on how it uses it, and it's made it very much less valuable. So on that, they go to the COP meetings, and they're working there. We hear reports on that. It was very interesting. The nice road that we drove out into Marspit on was the result of local advocacy. And I didn't hear about it in detail, but I was told, we'd briefly met the director of Caritas Isiola, so another diocese, who had once been a CAFOD employee, but now he was directing that. And we were told, oh yes, he did a pilgrimage walking the length of this road before there was a road. It took him a month to walk into Nairobi as a kind of part of the advocacy, and CAFOD supported that in some way. So there's kind of advocacy, and looking at, and so one of the really grim things about the situation in Marsabit in particular is it's part of Kenya. Kenya is not a rock bottom poor country in general. And along the road, before we saw the ostriches, we saw giant polytunnels where they're growing vegetables and flowers for Europe. So, but anyways, one of the things that that Verity, the CAFOD manager I was with, was asking Isako, the local development leader, was, are you doing advocacy with the Kenyan government? And it's just routine that you can't only address the problem, you also have to be doing advocacy. And he said, yes, we are. So that, so I think that kind of nationally and internationally CAFOD is, and its partners are. And often CAFOD is supporting partners to do advocacy. So when it gets a place at COP, it often uses it to bring the voice of somebody from Latin America or Africa and supports them. It's part of CAFOD's effort, again, not to make ourselves the center of this story. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for introducing the injustice theme. Like, do you have any other comments that you want? No, okay. If there's time, is there time for one more theme? So we didn't meet this bishop of Marsabit the first day because we got there very late, but we did at the end of the second day, so driven all around very dusty roads, or not even roads, partly that we were on. At the end of the day, we arrive at the bishop's office. So it's a courtesy visit that we were making, and he was very nice, not wearing clerical garb, but he had a cross on, gets along very well with the local, with the Caritas agency, supports it very well. So Isako was telling us that's not true of every diocese, and sometimes you can get a bishop who's not interested. And then he said it's like they flick a bunch of switches and the Caritas agency of that diocese becomes ineffective, which was really striking because you hear exactly the same stories about a priest who comes into a new parish and can kill off a lot of what's happening. And so I thought, oh, there's something Catholic about that. But anyways, so he was very nice, mild-mannered, humble, intelligent-seeming guy. I had a cold, so he was very worried that I looked tired after a long day with a cold, which I just found somehow strange that was the worry that he was expressing in that moment. But he told us about the situation, and there was a sense of it really weighing on him and troubling him. But the thing that really stuck in my mind was there was a phrase that he used several times where he said, "I believe in the living God," in the midst of this. And then he said once, "I believe in the living God, and I trust that no one will die." And I've really wrestled with this statement because he was a serious man. He was seriously involved. He was an intelligent man. He knew much better than I did the situation. It's so improbable that no one will die. And so I thought, that's crazy. And at the same time, I thought, oh, I've just been taught the nature of faith that he says this. There was something very faithful about. And so I've been wrestling with how can I have that double. I mean, I haven't gone back and asked him. I can't even find his email address. But it's more a question for me. How could that be both implausible and a very moving expression of faith? So he's a bishop looking at the people of his diocese on the point of disaster and affirming his trust in God and affirming that the disaster won't come. So the best I've been able to come up with for an explanation of how this could be is three things. The first is, but if you have a better one, please help me with it. But the first is, when you're facing the terrible thing for someone that you know and love, you don't give up hope so easily. You don't just accept the statistical likelihood. If it's your child, if it's a person close to you, you go on hoping and believing and looking for a solution that's not. So it's not like a general truth. There's a famine coming, people will die. It's these people that I know, these villages, these places, these people, I'm going to go on hoping. So that's one thing. A second thing is, maybe it's the fact that there's no real necessity for people to die of this famine. That image of the polytunnels that we passed, the sense that it's the lack of response that's the problem. There's no absolute need for people to die. There's no absolute shortage of food. So maybe he trusts in God that this non-necessary disaster doesn't have to happen. And maybe, so that's my second explanation. And my third is, or not explanation, but attempt to understand what's going on. The third is just that, maybe for me, the bishop was testifying to two realities at the same time. One was he was truthful in the reality he saw. He could see how bad things were. And another was he was saying that's not the ultimate reality. He was deliberately recentering himself on his faith, on a belief in God who's living, who's not passive, not ineffective. Whatever that means, he's going to hang on to that. But anyways, it's a slightly sobering thought to end with, unless anybody can help me with a better one.
Well, it is the language you're very aware of in desperation, isn't it?
Yeah, same idea. Really. That echoes what we read in the Psalms sometimes, isn't it? People just kind of crying out to God for justice.
Yeah.
So, of course, being part of the universal church, and the universal church is not starving, and the people could come to his rescue. I mean,
It felt a bit like the last cry of possibility, yeah.
I mean, it is when you think about it. As you say, there's no reason why anybody should starve in this modern setup, but they do. Because the imbalance is huge.
Yeah. And I think the tablet ran a piece last week about how after the last drought in 2017 or 2011, somebody said, this will never happen again. We will watch the early warning signals. And the early warning signals have been reported and we haven't watched them. So there is this real sense this is a non-necessity. One thing I've been linking it to is a thing that we teach our first-year students about Augustine's understanding of the nature of evil as a privatio boni, an absence of the good. And the students usually get quite frustrated and they think that's not a dramatic enough, that's not an interesting enough way to describe evil, but it really seems to fit. It's the absence of the trucks, it's the absence of the attention, it's the absence of the response that should be there that is pretty dramatic if it's going to lead to huge consequences. So. I feel like you can end on a lighter note. I've not done a very good job of that.
Karen's job as being professor is a unique job because it's both a prestigious academic post but carries with it the role, as you mentioned, of outreach and being a theological advisor to the diocese and so on. I think we've seen tonight why Karen is exactly the right person for that job. There's been a real depth of theological reflection and a breadth of vision, but also the sort of hard, gritty reality of getting down there on the ground and sharing in people's experiences and also being moved with compassion, which is at the heart of all our things. We should all be moved with compassion when we hear about these realities. So, Karen, thank you for all that you've shared with us. Thank you for showing us the bigger picture and perhaps the deeper reflection on what's really going on. Plenty to think about, plenty to pray about, plenty to reflect on as individual disciples and as a community. So, Karen, thank you very much. I know everybody in this room does support CAFOD generously, so I don't need to do the plug.
Thanks for listening and your comments.